The world has witnessed countless wars, but very few conflicts ever reach the point where historians later ask a terrifying question. What if a nation had almost ceased to exist entirely? Not metaphorically, but politically, territorially, and socially erased from the map of the modern world. This story begins in a time of uneasy peace, where official statements claimed stability, but behind closed doors, intelligence agencies were already tracking unusual military movements. Nothing dramatic at first, just small shifts in borders, quiet deployments, and diplomatic meetings that ended too quickly to be reassuring. As tensions slowly escalated, governments tried to maintain the illusion of control. Leaders gave speeches about unity and diplomacy, but internal reports told a different story, one of rising mistrust, economic pressure, and silent preparations for something far larger than anyone was willing to publicly admit. Before the first shot was fired, analysts had already warned that the situation was unstable beyond repair. Yet those warnings were buried under bureaucracy and political hesitation. Every delay created the conditions for a conflict that no one would be able to contain once it began. Then the border changed everything. What was once a controlled line between two nations became a flashpoint of rapid escalation. Small incidents of intrusion were reported, followed by counter-movements that turned defensive strategies into offensive positioning on both sides. When the first strike finally occurred, it did not resemble traditional warfare. There was no formal declaration, no warning broadcast, only sudden, overwhelming impact on a strategically critical region. Within hours, entire communication systems collapsed, leaving commanders blind in the middle of a rapidly evolving crisis. The shock was not just the attack itself, but how quickly the targeted region was rendered operationally invisible. Satellite feeds became unreliable. Ground communication failed. Entire divisions lost contact with central command, creating confusion that spread faster than any physical destruction. What followed was not a controlled military response, but fragmentation. Units acted independently, governments issued conflicting orders, and civilians were left completely outside the chain of information. In that vacuum, fear became the dominant force shaping every decision. As cities began to fall under pressure, the conflict expanded far beyond its original borders. Infrastructure was not just damaged, it was systematically disrupted. Transportation routes collapsed, supply chains broke apart, and entire regions were cut off without clear timelines for recovery. Civilian populations found themselves trapped in a situation they could neither understand nor escape. Families were separated in the chaos of evacuation orders, while others were forced to remain in zones where basic services had completely ceased to function. International observers attempted to intervene diplomatically, but the speed of escalation made traditional negotiation almost irrelevant. By the time meetings were scheduled, the reality on the ground had already changed twice over. Meanwhile, information itself became a weapon. Each side released conflicting narratives, each attempting to control global perception. Truth became fragmented, and even neutral observers struggled to distinguish verified reports from strategic misinformation. The turning point arrived when a major strategic region, critical for both military logistics and political control, became the center of an extended and brutal confrontation. Neither side could afford to lose it, yet neither could secure it without massive cost. The battle that unfolded there was not a quick engagement, but a prolonged collapse of structure and endurance. Soldiers described it later not in terms of victory or defeat, but in terms of exhaustion, confusion, and survival under impossible conditions. Days turned into a continuous cycle of impact and resistance, where advances were measured in meters rather than kilometers, and where control shifted so frequently that maps became obsolete almost immediately after being drawn. When the conflict finally shifted in momentum, it did so without clarity or ceremony. One side did not win decisively, but the other simply began to lose cohesion. That distinction would come to define the entire outcome of the war. As retreat began, entire defensive lines collapsed not through single defeats, but through accumulated breakdowns in coordination. Communication failures, resource shortages, and internal instability combined into a chain reaction that could not be reversed. Governments attempted emergency stabilization measures, but by this stage, authority itself was fragmented. Local commanders made independent decisions, regions acted without central approval, and political control became increasingly symbolic rather than functional. Then came the revelation that changed everything historians thought they understood about the war. Classified documents began to surface suggesting that elements of the conflict had been anticipated far earlier than publicly acknowledged. Not only had scenarios been predicted, but in some cases, escalation models had closely matched the actual progression of events. This raised a disturbing possibility. The war may not have been purely accidental in its trajectory. Investigations followed, slowly uncovering layers of ignored warnings, political manipulation, and strategic miscalculations that had collectively contributed to the scale of destruction. Accountability, however, proved difficult to establish in such a complex system of shared failure. As the war officially ended, reconstruction began, but the damage extended far beyond physical infrastructure. Trust between institutions had been fractured, populations displaced, and entire regions permanently altered in their political identity. In the aftermath, maps were redrawn, treaties rewritten, and alliances restructured. But beneath all of that, a more subtle change had occurred, the realization that even modern nations are not immune to near erasure under the pressure of total war. And so the final question remains, one that still unsettles historians today. Was this conflict simply a failure of diplomacy and control? Or was it a moment when the world came closer than ever before to witnessing the disappearance of a nation?